Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well. In just a sec, we'll get to the recording of the session that we had with Bill Mulligan, where we got into technical questions, we got into the nitty gritty of Cilium and eBPF. We also touched upon Bill's background and what lies ahead in the future for endeavors for Isovalent and other topics. We also had peppered in between questions from the live audience. It was a really cool session, and if you're wondering why I'm talking to you actually right now, it's because there was a little bit of a technical difficulty while we were recording. I forgot to start the recording in the middle of the intro, so that's what I'm going to do now. Introduce Bill Mulligan so we can get to know the speaker, and then we'll quickly cut to the recording of last week's session. So for those of you who don't know, Bill Mulligan is a giant in the open source community. He comes from a very diverse background, having pursued a bachelor's degree in biochemistry from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and later obtained a Master of Science from the University of Oxford. He was a research assistant for many years before transitioning onto the track that he's on now. Bill's journey into the open source scene began at Kubernetes, where he had a significant impact, closing huge sales and creating a huge amount of high quality content that was widely published at the time. Afterwards, he transitioned into a role of marketing manager at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. During his time at the CNCF, Bill contributed to promoting and advancing cloud native technologies, amongst other things, playing a pivotal role bringing Kubernetes community days to life. Currently, Bill is doing amazing community work for Isovalent, actively participating and pollinating the Cilium and eBPF communities. In addition to his professional accomplishments, Bill is a FinOps Foundation member, KubeCon program committee member, and speaker. So having said that, I'm going to cut over to our session now. And just so you know, at this point, Bill is telling us about the fact that he doesn't actually have any coding skills. He's never really tried to pick them up, and how that plays into his background. The conversation from here on in got really interesting, so I hope you enjoy it.
And I don't know how to, and I think that's probably gives me a unique perspective compared to a lot of people trying to break into the industry thinking that they need to learn how to code first, but there's lots of other ways to get involved too.
Is that something that you were aware of at the time, or like early on, did you think to yourself, oh, maybe I should learn to code, or it's not something that you've been that interested in?
I've tried before, but honestly, I just don't have the patience for it. Like misplacing things or getting things slightly wrong, like the tiny details just kill me and just really like hurt my motivation. I'm like kind of a big picture type of person.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a very widely cited skill also. I do know that you live in Berlin, and you've been living there for a good few years now. Was that like a profession related decision? Is it anything about like the German tech scene that brought you there, or not so much?
I would say yes and no. So I was doing my master's in the UK, and my best friend there was German, and he was kind of involved in the startup scene in Berlin. And he was like, essentially, "Yeah, come to Berlin. There's lots of things happening, and you'll be able to find a job." And so I booked a one-way flight, packed a bag, and slept on his couch until I found a job. So it was, I guess, maybe more of a personal decision, but also like Berlin has a very kind of like fast-moving tech scene, so there was a lot of like job opportunities there. Is kind of why I went.
What's easier to learn, German or coding?
Oof. Oh, man, that's a tough one. I've definitely made more progress in German, but that's through a lot of concerted effort. I've not put as much effort into trying to learn how to code. Um, but yeah, I really couldn't say.
So it's good to know that like a very specific type of torture for you would be to go to like an advanced coding class in German.
Oh, yeah, that would be, I think, brutal.
Nice. And yeah, I have a few other questions here, but if you want, let's just jump straight into the to the thick of it, because there's actually a good few kind of questions about eBPF and Cilium that I was wondering about. So just to lay down kind of like the foundation for this conversation, could you like share a little bit about how eBPF and Cilium fit into Isovalent, and like from a community perspective, like what's on the forefront of your mind lately?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a couple different parts to this question. So I'll start out with talking about what eBPF is and then what Cilium is and how they relate to Isovalent. So eBPF is kind of the foundational technology for both Cilium and really everything that Isovalent does. It's a Linux kernel technology that allows people to extend the functionality of the Linux kernel. Traditionally, this has been like a multi-year, like really long process, and eBPF allows it to be like almost instantaneous. And one way, kind of like two examples that people like to use is one is kind of like what JavaScript brought to the browser, where instead of having just static web pages, you could suddenly have interactive elements where you could like add additional functionality like forms and buttons and different things like that. The other example that I think maybe more people can relate to is thinking of it a little bit like the advent of like the smartphone and the app store, whereas the original phones came with whatever the manufacturer gave you, right? So that's like what the Linux kernel is. But suddenly when we had smartphones in the app store, programmers could extend the functionality of what was available for your phone by adding an application to it. And that's kind of what eBPF allows you to do to the kernel. So for example, like say you need to have new routing information. Well, you could download Google Maps and it'll help you steer you around your environment. eBPF, you can also have like networking programs like Cilium does that allows you to reroute traffic within the kernel. So kind of being able to programmatically extend what you can do, which is a really exciting thing and something that's kind of as old and widely deployed as the Linux kernel. And so eBPF is this really foundational and powerful technology that kind of enables all the use cases that we do with Cilium and at Isovalent. And so Cilium is originally began as a networking technology, but is expanded into more of a cloud native platform around networking, observability, and security. So allowing people to connect computers together, see if all those connections are working, and then protect them from malicious actors. And it does this in a variety of different ways where we can, I think, dive into some more of the details we want to later on. But I think that's at a high level what Cilium does. And then Isovalent provides an enterprise distribution of Cilium to large companies around the world, tackling different use cases in industries like telecommunications, financial services, SaaS companies, insurance, and a bunch more. So,
Cool. Very comprehensive. If we think, would it be fair to say like that eBPF is like a programming language that at the kernel layer? Or?
Yeah, so eBPF is actually a bytecode. So you can write eBPF, or you can write programs in a couple different languages, and then that will be compiled down into eBPF bytecode, which will then be loaded into the kernel. So eBPF isn't a language by itself. Other languages are compiled into eBPF bytecode, and then that's compiled into the kernel and what actually provides the programs in the kernel.
And how difficult would it be is the learning curve pretty steep to learn eBPF, the code that turns into bytecode? Is it similar to like Lua or like WebAssembly?
Yeah, so most eBPF programs are written in like C++. So it depends on if you're familiar with that. Though, if you want to learn more about it, Liz Rice, who's actually my boss, has a book called Learning eBPF, and that's about kind of like writing eBPF programs. Though I would say it's kind of interesting. I actually don't think most people are going to be writing eBPF programs. Most people are going to be leveraging applications that use eBPF. So a lot of people aren't going to be writing eBPF programs, but they be using something like Cilium because of what eBPF enables them to do. And so having an understanding of like what eBPF does, a little bit how it works, and what it enables, I think is a good thing to have. But actually being able to write programs, I don't think is that important because most people will be consuming eBPF programs through, I guess, like higher level applications like Cilium, like Hubble, like Tetragon.
Mm. No, yeah, thanks a million, and I'll find that book and I'll link it down there in the description below, so it's easily accessible. Yeah, no, I was only wondering just to know from the contributor kind of perspective, would someone need to learn eBPF to be able to maybe contribute to a project like Cilium, which is, I'm sure there are some areas that might be necessary, but I'm sure there's many tasks and issues that wouldn't require that.
Yeah, so there's a couple different things that you can do. So if you go to ebpf.io, which is a great resource about learning about eBPF, there's actually a contribute page and it highlights a couple different ways that you can get involved kind of in the ecosystem. One is contributing to the actual eBPF runtime in the kernel. This is probably like the most complex one because that's upstreaming things into the Linux kernel, which is, if you don't know anything about it, is a pretty technical thing to do. There
It's quite low
are
level.
like, yeah, yeah. Like easier ways to do it. One is like contributing to an eBPF project, for example, Cilium. If you go on to the Cilium on GitHub, you'll see and go into the issues. You can see ones marked good first issues, and that'll be on a variety of different things. Though, if you are just kind of like new to open source, the thing I'd recommend more is to looking into things about like documentation. Like actually, my first contribution to open source was just fixing a broken link in the Kubernetes documentation. And then I kind of increased my involvement from there. So if you want to start contributing, there's lots of different ways to do it. But I'd encourage you, like anybody starting in open source, like start small and then build from there.
Yeah, and speaking of projects that are built on eBPF, it's really incredible just how popular and just like the kind of opportunities that the opening or at least the widespread adoption of eBPF has created, right? So there's loads of projects, including Cilium, but I think Meta has a load balancing tool called Katran, and there's projects being heavily like worked on in the security, application observability, and of course networking. But in your opinion, like what is it about EPF that makes it such a popular kind of technology to build upon? Is it because it's just very fast?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple different things that make eBPF, I guess, such a hot technology right now. So one is what you were talking about on the performance side. So since eBPF is running into the kernel rather than in user space, it has a performance boost because it's not switching context between kernel space and user space. And so a lot of people are switching to like Cilium just because of the performance and scalability benefits that eBPF brings to them. So that's one reason that people switch to it. Another one is really it's unlocking things that they couldn't do before, right? So the Linux kernel is kind of a slow development cycle, right? And so if it takes 5 years from writing the code to actually getting it in production, well, that's quite a long development cycle. And so with eBPF, if you can do it instantly, suddenly you can do a lot more things with your kernel. And so you can do things in a new way that you couldn't do before, and so that unlocks new use cases for people. Yeah, and I would say one of the last reasons that people are choosing eBPF is because it's enabling them to like think about problems in a new way and approach them differently.
Yeah, this reminds me. I had a conversation. When was it? I think it was at the end of last week with Alex Jones, the head of Kubernetes at Canonical, and we were talking a little bit about KGPT, and eBPF came up specifically in conversation when we were talking about just the increased adoption of multi-cloud and how eBPF has really paved the way to make certain particularly difficult issues with how multi-cloud implementations were executed in the past and how they've kind of like gotten rid of that. And there's an example in particular that I wanted to bring up. I was watching a presentation from the eBPF Summit 2022. I'm just going to leave the link here in the chat. And so in this presentation, an engineer from S&P Global, he talked about like the growing need for application and network engineers to be more aligned, and especially in multi-cloud environments. And he goes on to talk about, there's a very cool graph. If you don't watch the whole video, at least just find this graph in which he mentions that the Cilium CNI was used almost as like the highway that connects. I think their particular use case was Azure and AWS, and it was really incredible how implementing the Cilium CNI really got rid of a lot of issues and made maintaining the multi-cloud environment much easier, and observability became much easier also. So I just wanted to ask you if you could speak a little bit about where you see the kind of evolution of Cilium and projects that are built on eBPF in this kind of multi-cloud environment. How does Cilium, like what kind of issues do you think Cilium really helps out with in these scenarios?
Yeah, so I think eBPF, the cool thing about it is that it's a foundational technology. It's part of the Linux kernel itself. And so it's actually available anywhere that Linux is available, which is actually quite a broad distribution of things. And I think we're actually kind of seeing like an interesting use case here where in the telecommunications industry, so that's like one industry that's like heavily focused on the performance of the networks and how it's doing. And why they're thinking about turning to eBPF is because as they move from like hardware-based networking, where you're actually using like the physical network boxes, towards more like software-defined networking, and doing things network acceleration in software, the limitation that they found is the things that they needed to increase the performance weren't available everywhere, right? So suddenly your network performance became dependent on which software you were deploying where and whether it was available or not. And so, right, this kind of brings in some operational complexity. And now with eBPF, we kind of have this new generation of technology where it's actually available everywhere. Anywhere that's running Linux has eBPF available. And so that provides you a lot of benefits in kind of consistency of operations and of scalability. And so kind of like leveling this up towards like the talk that you like referenced is S&P Global was talking about how essentially eBPF like through Cilium allowed them to have a consistent networking experience across all of their multi-cloud environments. Right? And so that's the benefit of eBPF, but also of open source, is that you're not tied into like one vendor solution, right? Because especially at large companies, you're going to be running a little bit of everything. And so if you can essentially have a technology that's available everywhere, it helps really provide a much more consistent experience for like all of your developers and really eases the operational burden of running that software at scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Alex came up with an interesting analogy during our conversation. He said that in the multi-cloud implementation, you would think of the hyperscaler of the actual cloud as like a table at a restaurant, and that a lot of these cloud native tools, they're coming along to kind of pick up the pieces, the kind of crumbs that fall off the table when things go from one table to another. But then what I see when I see this graph of Cilium CNI, it's not just picking up the crumbs. This is bringing a whole new table that kind of like goes on top of the other two tables. It's incredible that this kind of layer of abstraction that can be built upon this multi-cloud architecture, and it just opens up a whole new world of possibilities of architecture design that can de-risk the individual organization, but could potentially just make things easier, more manageable. It's really interesting. But of course we're looking at, well, I'm looking at one of the graphs here from that video. But speaking of kind of like the visual aspect of Cilium, could you tell us a little bit about Hubble? I think Hubble is the UI that goes along with Cilium. And if an organization, for example, because you could use Cilium without Hubble, right?
Yeah, you can use Cilium without Hubble.
Would what
Yeah.
would a like a sorry for cutting you off, but what would like a company be missing if it didn't use Hubble to its capacity?
Yeah, so I'll actually take you back to the founding story of Hubble to kind of explain this. And so Isovalent's a Swiss company. It really has its roots in like going out into the mountains, skiing, hiking, all those different things. And so at one of the design summits, it was in the winter and they were hiking up a mountain to ski down it. And they got up towards the top and the clouds started to close in and suddenly they couldn't see where they were going at all. Kind of like through this, they kind of realized the importance of observability to know where you're going. Otherwise, you're suddenly lost in the clouds, like literally. And so that's kind of what sparked the idea of Hubble, is being able to provide observability in the world of cloud native. And so what Hubble provides on top of Cilium is kind of this network observability, right? So Cilium is controlling the whole networking of your infrastructure, how everything's connected together, but you're not concerned about like just connecting it all together. You're also want to know, are all of those connections working at the same time too? And that's what Hubble provides, is this kind of network observability to actual users. And I actually think this is probably, from talking to a lot of end users of Cilium, this is one of kind of like the most unexpected but like favorite parts of Cilium. I don't think right now a lot of people are choosing Cilium because of Hubble, but once people have Cilium installed and they enable Hubble, they don't want to turn it off because of the visibility that it provides them. Like one of the quotes is, yeah, once I installed Hubble, I was able to reduce the debugging time from 2 engineers, like 8 hours, down to a couple of minutes. And that was a really easy cost savings to be able to justify to my CEO, right? And
Mm.
so the visibility and the observability that Hubble provides, I think, is a massive benefit for people using Cilium.
Yeah, especially in the, I was going to say, especially in the open source ecosystem, sometimes design isn't the first thing that's prioritized. That's kind of becoming less and less. I mean, there's incredibly beautiful projects out there with incredibly nice graphical user interfaces and stuff like that. But if you think to other examples in the open source community, like Mongo, like Mongo has been successful or MongoDB has been successful for many different reasons, but one of the reasons for sure is just how easy the UI is to use, and just kind of like what a pleasure it is to use. So I could totally see why Hubble really helps out in that regard. Um, Moving on, taking it a little bit more towards your thoughts about kind of community and yeah, like DevRel in general. I just wanted to remark on a tweet that you put out not too long ago, and I quote: "Sustained community involvement is also a better way to make a name for yourself in open source than one-off code contributions. And there are often more long-term opportunities to help out with a project in non-coding tasks." So I had kind of like two questions that I wanted to ask you from this. The first one is, what are some examples of long-term ways to help out with non-coding activities that you would consider to be most valuable?
Yeah, so I can actually talk about like my experience. So like there's a lot of behind the scene works that I do to help make the project successful. So things like organizing the website, helping keeping the documentation up to date, improving the governance of the project and making sure that the governance process is running smoothly, run different marketing activities like Cilium or helping the project move between different CNCF levels. And I think really a lot of other things. I think when people start to kind of like see you as this resource um, in the community, like more opportunities open themselves up for you. And so I think what's cool about like community building versus like coding. So coding, you're like developing a feature and you get feedback from a couple different people and you're kind of like asking other people to help you. But I think community building is kind of like turning that on its head where you're like putting work out by asking um, other people how you can help them, right? And so suddenly you're helping out all these different people in the community, and so you're really starting to build a name for yourself as someone that's helpful, that's a resource, and is a key member in the community. And I think in some ways it's a lot easier to do doing non-code contributions than actual coding, because to really become kind of like a key member of the coding community, you have to be like been around a long time, kind of like know the architecture of the whole project, been providing like really good code, really good reviews. I think that's a lot harder and longer process, right? I don't know how to code at all, but I've been able to become a maintainer of the Cilium project in, I would say, not an extremely long time. But for me to become really the maintainer of Cilium on the code side would take years.
Yeah, and I don't really know how to, because I was going to ask after this, like, but maybe since your experience is a little bit different, what would you say for those people who are potentially not don't have the technical skills or the coding skills that they would like, and that they feel that to make a contribution they would really need to ramp that up. How can they get started in a kind of like practical way? Be it by ramping up their skills in some way that you might find interesting, or how would they find that kind of non-coding contribution task that could be valuable?
Yeah. So I would actually kind of like reverse it a little bit. And I think a lot of people say you should just start contributing to open source, but I would actually, in some ways, disagree with that. Like, I think you should start contributing to open source that you're using, right? So, my first contribution to Kubernetes was fixing documentation that I was reading because I needed it to write a blog post, right? And so, like, ways that you're only going to have sustained involvement and commitment to something that you're interested in yourself. And so I would look at projects that you're using in your own personal life or your professional life or whatever else, because those are going to be the things that are most important for you. And a great way to get started, because as you're using something, you'll start to find, little bugs or like other things that could be slightly improved upon. You'll start to see what some of the good first issues are by using the software or anything else. And so I think a great way is to like look at what you're using, and as you start to use it, you'll find those easy ways to contribute. And as you start contributing, you'll get more familiar with the process, the people, and other things about the project, and you'll find more and more ways to contribute to.
That's great advice. I haven't I haven't really like thought about it that much, but yeah, it makes so much more sense. Like if you, because of course, like from the server side, the community that you're contributing to, no matter if you're an actual user or not, they're going to be happy, right? Because this is another contributor and contributing value. But from the client side, on your side, you're thinking, yeah, but I would like to do something sustained, and I'll value that. That's going to help me kind of like grow my social capital. How am I going to do that consistently? Well, if you use it, and yeah, and if you're actually interested in a kind of like in a deeper way. Interesting. Yeah, it sounds simple, but I haven't really heard that opinion voiced that much. So cool. We have a question here from Avanesh. I'll just read it out. It says that eBPF, when used for security or searching for vulnerabilities, can read packets. Do you think data privacy comes into risk while trying to secure things with eBPF?
Yeah, so I don't really think so, any more so than any other tool. I think like eBPF itself is just a tool, right? It's inspecting network packets. It's telling it either to forward it on, to drop it, to like change this thing. just like other like networking software before it, right? And so like the data privacy thing is like a bit, I think, outside of the scope of eBPF, because eBPF programs can basically only be enabled by like privileged applications. If you're a privileged application, hopefully you kind of have the reason to process that data, and like you're going to be setting up like programs just to do that. And so I think data privacy is a bit outside the scope of eBPF. It's the tool, whereas the data privacy is really the process around the data and tools that you have. And so I think eBPF is like any other technology. It can be used for good and for bad, but like data privacy specifically, I think is how you implement it.
I think the onus on security would probably be on your choice of privacy model, right? Like if
Yeah.
you're implementing like zero trust, then you have a bunch of different kind of fault areas, and if there's any breach, that probably has more to do with that than eBPF. Um,
Yeah. So eBPF will help you like secure things more efficiently, but it's not gonna stop you from misusing that data. Right.
yeah. Um, I have one more question before moving on to a section that I find is usually quite fun. But just to get to that last question, in a recent conversation that you had with Bart Farrell, who's a mutual friend of ours, you spoke about the how incremental changes and improvements is something that you wished you had learned beforehand, and how those incremental changes kind of compound over the process of community building and just a career in general. The realization that community growth only comes through time wasn't maybe as apparent to you in the beginning. What other kind of like community related learnings have you picked up that weren't very intuitive at the beginning?
Yeah, so I think kind of related to that, and maybe building on it a little bit more, is the thing that I didn't realize, I guess, quite at the beginning is the community is not a broadcast network. It's not, like somebody on TV, like what you're in your talking to thousands of people like watching the nightly news, right? That's not a community. A community is actually, I would say, a network of one-to-one interactions. Like people feel a sense of community and belonging when they feel connected to the people around them. And the only way that you can really do that is building a one-on-one connection with another person. And so the whole aspect of community building is a lot of, individual conversations between a bunch of different people. And it looks kind of like this mesh network, right? And so that's why, tying back to the previous point, like the whole process of building a community is a bunch of small interactions, a bunch of one-on-one interactions, is connecting a bunch of people together and building that sense of belonging community around a specific thing. And that can't be done overnight, right? You don't trust somebody immediately just because you've had one conversation with them, or they've just told you something in a Slack message. It's about working with individuals over a longer period, and I think that's what really creates a strong, a vibrant, and will eventually end up probably being a growing community.
Yeah, I think definitely one of the ideas that I or one of the assumptions that I was kind of like working of, um, just think of like what I thought when I started the project of trying to build a community for Tailwarden. It was like, okay, in my mind, I have this huge stadium because, of course, the objective is in the future, like the coming years, to just speak in front of thousands of people and to have this vibrant and excited community all revolved about around something that you're bringing or that you're all building together. So in my mind, I'm just kind of like thinking of a stadium and then think to myself, okay, so how many seats are in the stadium? So we need to start filling it. And one of the unchallenged assumptions that I think I had is that the community is going to be centralized in a place in one platform, or that every time we put something out, there's going to be like a cohesive kind of response from this kind of crowd. But then you realize it's not that. It is much more decentralized. Um, the strive shouldn't be to to have conversations in just one platform, in one arena, um, not one to many, but one to one.
Yeah, definitely.
That took me
I
a
think
while.
there's yeah, yeah, I totally agree, and I think it's maybe something hard to grasp if you haven't like worked on it a lot, and also yeah, you can't like control the community, right? It's people doing whatever they want to, like with their neighbor, rather than telling a lot of people what to do.
Yeah, exactly. Before we jump into the to overrated, underrated, we have a question here from Shubham. Do you see XDP becoming more prevalent than eBPF at some point in time because it's again at a deeper layer than the kernel? Um, Example, the network interface card.
Yeah. So XTP is like kind of a part of eBPF, so I wouldn't really put them as like kind of competing technologies. I think a lot of people would refer to XTP as part of eBPF. In terms of like more prevalent, I would argue that eBPF is actually going to continue to stay more prevalent because it's kind of like a superset, right? XTP is more like specific and it's just about like kind of like how do we process things coming like right off the hardware, like even before it hits the Linux kernel networking stack. And so that's like very like some very specific use cases. It has a lot of benefits, but it's pretty specific where eBPF is much more general purpose and has like I think probably much broader applicability across networking, observability, security, tracing, monitoring, a lot more things you can do with it. So I think we'll probably see more use cases with eBPF than with XDP specifically.
Yeah, thanks a million, Shubham, and also thanks a million, Avanesh, for the questions. If you have any follow up questions, feel free to write in the chat. I'm just going to go ahead and start with overrated, underrated. So yeah, this is just a little kind of dynamic that I like to do at the end. I got this idea from a podcast that I like to listen to. The conversations with Tyler, if anyone's interested, but yeah. So I'm just going to ask you a few on a few topics. If you want, you can just say with one word, overrated, underrated, in your opinion, and if you want to expand on it, feel free. Okay, the first one is working or taking part in sorry, let me read this a little bit better. Outside of work communities and participating in them, like the midnight runners. Overrated or underrated?
Underrated. I love my life outside of work.
Yeah, and this kind of like goes back to what you were saying, what you were mentioning before, right? If there's a community that you're actually interested in, participate in it. Like,
Yeah.
but have you seen that participating and helping out other communities has kind of like retroactively or indirectly influenced how you work? You do community work professionally.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the work that I do, like in my private life, to kind of like organize community is very much related to the work I do kind of like in my professional life. And I think they both learn from each other. I don't think like one is kind of like better like than the other. They're both. I learn from both of them.
Mm-hmm. When's your next run?
We run every Wednesday at 7:30.
Nice, nice. We actually have two members on the of the team who live in Berlin. I don't know if they're big runners though, but I'll definitely let them know.
Yeah,
Um,
that'd be great.
Moving on to the next one. Non-linear professional paths.
Underrated. um, I don't think I've ever had a set career path. I think you've kind of seen I've gone from biochemistry to like social sciences. Then I was doing machine learning, a bit in telecommunications. Now I'm doing community building. And I think it's if you look at my career path, it's somewhat linear because I was doing something plus something, and that kind of plus something is kind of like whatever I did like next in my career path. right? And so that plus something became then that thing plus something else, and that kind of like led me to the next thing. I like to think of it more like expanding into adjacent interesting opportunities is what I've always done. And so taking what I've already know or working on and expanding it like at the intersection of something new. That's led me to a lot of interesting things.
That's it's so cool to know that your next career choice is going to be professional runner.
Yeah, I wish.
Um, okay, overrated, underrated, currywurst.
Oh, extremely overrated.
Oh, really?
They're awesome. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's not even close. Like the only time I get a currywurst in Berlin is when I have tourists visiting me. I'm like, this is a Berlin thing that people say you should have. But like, absolutely, like doner kebab beats currywurst any day of the week.
Oh, for sure, for sure. But I totally agree. But I wouldn't compare them. Like every time I go, I like to have just one. But like for example, like for me, what's definitely overrated are bagel. Not pretzels. Like the thick,
Yeah,
kind of like bigger pretzels. I don't get it. It's like it's really dry. What's so like? I do not get it.
yeah, yeah.
Uh, okay, moving on. Wisconsin Badgers.
Underrated. I love the Badgers. I mean, you can't see it now, but like I have like a bunch of like Badger stuff. I always go back and support the team. I invited all my friends to Wisconsin last year to go to a Badger football game. I think like kind of like the atmosphere in the town on game day is super fun. If you haven't been to like a Big Ten sporting event, I think it's definitely something to do. It's quite
Yeah,
fun.
yeah. For those of you
Underrated.
who don't know, the Wisconsin Badgers are the football team, the university, American football team. Uh, they, I mean, I know some incredible players that have come from Wisconsin, but nationally, like in the States, is it underrated, or would people like have that university in high regard?
The university definitely in high regard. The football program is also like quite well known. It's not like a top tier one, but it's I would say like usually ranked in like the top 10 or 20. So it's pretty well regarded. Um, yeah, and fun fact about that. So Russell Wilson, like the quarterback for the Seattle Seahawks who won the Super Bowl, he was actually our commencement speaker for graduation, and I actually got to introduce him. So because he's a Wisconsin Badger.
Yeah, yeah. He's probably one of the most famous Badgers. Wow.
Yeah.
Cool, cool, cool fun fact. I'm glad I asked. Okay, and just to finish up with an overrated, underrated, in-person tech conferences.
Underrated. Yeah. I think there's something very cool about bringing people together that you just can't capture online. And I think if I look back on my career, kind of like all the most important things I've done have been because of like people I've met at in-person conferences. And so I think I 100% believe in remote work. I love it. I don't think I'll ever change, but I will also 100% always go to in-person conferences because I think they're super valuable to go and discuss and get things done.
I- Is there kind of like an optimal amount of days though? Like a one person, sorry, a 1 day tech conference is pretty underrated. 2 days underrated. 3 days it gets a bit overrated. Have you seen that?
Oof. There's like KubeCon. I think like KubeCon is like definitely like kind of like on the edge. I think like day four is like where it really starts to
Yeah, become a
like
slog.
yeah. I think like 5 days is overrated. I'm glad that they switched to 4 days now. And then for like small in-person conferences, I also think like 1 day is great. You can go there, like see everybody, chat, and then you go home and boom, that's it.
Nice, nice, cool. Um, okay, yeah, I was just going to move on to the next two last questions, but I think we have a question here from Shubham. Do you have a bingo as this year's eBPF summit? D- do you have a bingo?
It's bingo.
Oh, bingo.
So like we were trying to say try to find all the EBs, and there was like a bingo card associated with it. We'd hide it in different places in the presentation.
Ah, I gotcha.
So
Yeah, sorry for that.
like inside knowledge. We haven't decided yet. There's going to be one at eBPF Summit. I'm just trying to get through the summer first. So unfortunately, I don't have any tips for getting a head start yet. But yes, you are the winner from last year.
Very nice. Cool. Yeah, so I just had a couple of outro questions. I was wondering, what's the Cilium Summer School, and who's it aimed for?
Yeah, so the Cilium Summer School, this is kind of building off what we did last summer, is kind of give people an opportunity to like refresh their knowledge about a certain topic. I think one thing that's definitely at the top of a lot of people's mind right now is like security and their software infrastructure. And so I'd recommend if you want to learn about kind of like software security and how to like lock down your cloud native infrastructure, you should go and attend there.
Very cool. And yeah, just last thing, what should people be aware of in the future? Anything related to Isovalent?
Um, if you want to subscribe to Echo News and you'll get all the latest updates on the Cilium and eBPF communities, I think that's a great place to stay like up to it. And if you ever see me at a conference, always feel free to say hi. I'm always happy to chat with different people and I like bouncing ideas off of different people.
Deadly. Sorry, did you say Eco News?
Yeah, Echo News.
Echo News.
It's a newsletter that I send out.
Very cool. Perfect. So that's everything that I had. Thanks a million for the answers. Some of them were either very informative or very funny. So thanks for that. If no one else has any questions, I think we can let you go.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for having me today. I enjoyed the conversation.
Cool.
So,
Have a good rest of the week.
yeah. Okay, thanks.
Go Badgers.
Later.